That was the big thumb from the king of the room, so it's time to start. I want to thank you for coming. This is the last of the 6 talks we've been given here. We started 3 days ago with the talk where we talked about all the products that we have in our division and tried to give you a picture of how they fit together. And then we've been talking about architecture, and we talked about logic architecture, data architecture, presentation architecture, security architecture. And the notion is when you're talking about architecture, you don't really say anything to anyone that they don't already know, or they can't pretend they already know when they hear you. You just try to get the ideas whittled down to a few simple ones, and that's been our goal, to try to give you a way of thinking about these areas, which is going to be A, useful, and B, consistent with how we're thinking about them, so you'll know where we're going. So you can imagine all the talks we've been given in the last few days as kind of futures talks as well as architecture talks. When you hear the guy who's doing the architecture of the product give you a here's how I think you ought to build apps talk, he's sort of telling you how he thinks the tool ought to work and the framework ought to work too. Well, the strategy that we have right now, our team is right now in M0. The way we organize our work is we have milestones that we called M. In Indigo, WCF, we had M0, M1, M2, M3.
M4, M5, M5.1, M5.
What happened, you took my thunder, Clemens.
Oh, sorry.
We promised somebody we would only go to M5, and so then we went to 5.1, 5.2. But what we do here is we're now in M0, and so our team is doing architectural thinking, and we're gathering scenarios, and we're trying to focus on putting together our plan. Our intention going forward is not to take long times to ship, but rather to ship on a 2.5 year cycle. So we're going to try to do better at giving a long-range vision of where we're going. And then we'll start telling you what we'll ship as we figure it out in the year before we ship. And so we're in this M0, which is everyone working on feature analysis, on high-level architecture. Next year we'll have 3 milestones, M1, M2, and M3. Each one, about 4 months long. Well, how many months would 4 months be in metric, Clemens?
You mean because the year is oddly split into 12 things?
Exactly. You have all this notion that we do it right over here. I was just asking.
Yeah.
Pardon my ignorance. So we're going to have 3 milestones. We'll probably start giving CTPs at the end of the 2nd milestone, so you'll be able to get your hand on the bits. And then in 2008, we'll go through some betas and some RCs, and we'll hope to pop, the end of next year, the beginning. And I'm just telling you what our current thinking is. But we aren't yet to the place where we can actually tell you what we plan on shipping next time. And so this talk is trying to tell you where we're at right now. And you can think of it as a talk about a roadmap, but instead of sort of laying it out in a marketing roadmap way, I want to tell you what our team is thinking about. The goals we have, the trends we see in the marketplace, and so on. And it's going to seem vague to some of you who were hoping for more specific statements that we're not ready to give yet. Not because we're not thinking them, but because we want to not promise you something that we then turn around and not do. But for others of you who have your ears open, you might learn a lot about what we're thinking about doing, especially in the roadmap sense. And so that's what I can do here. And if you're unhappy that I can't do more, I apologize ahead of time and promise we'll do better. I imagine next year at TechEd, we'll be rolling out our CTPs and giving you detailed information about our next release.
And we're going to say it's going to be called FooBar 2000 whatever, and
I think it'll be
have a logo.
I imagine it'll be called, part of it will be called Windows, and part of it will be called .NET, and part of it will be called Biztalk, because our division has a lot of deliverables, and we're going to have parts of it in each that work together. Or we'll make up some new name, but that's what you got marketing guys for, to worry about that. I don't care what it's called.
So we're here clearly at the pre-marketing stage.
Yeah, that's a dangerous thing. I can't believe we snuck this by them, actually.
What was that?
That was the little guy screaming, but there was no movement.
No, but actually the logo went away.
Uh-oh. See, there's this little arrow here.
Oh, no, you need to click backward to go forward.
I am clicking backward.
Are you?
See if you can make it move. Uh-oh. There we go.
No.
Uh-oh.
See, I say it backwards.
No, but believe you me, Clemens, you may assume I am an idiot, but I am clicking the backward button. It goes backward, but you know something, Clemens? We're going to have to collaborate at a new level. I'm going to make some sign, and you're going to change the slide.
So now I have found my reason why I'm here.
It's, you know, when you used to be technically proficient, you were a code monkey. Now you are a slide monkey.
I'm a PM.
That's what happens.
My job.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can do the thing that we did on the previous tour, right?
If you don't mind, I may, in fact, extemporize new gestures periodically.
Oh, okay.
Depending on how well you're behaving.
That's fine.
It may be a bow, or it may be an obscene gesture. We'll see. So,
actually, maybe because can you try that again just once?
Clemens.
I think I fixed it.
Ah. You are a technic. What did you do?
Oh, the mouse was hovering over this thing, and that confused that thing. Which means the wife was just not there to listen to the guy screaming. So I just.
Okay.
So I can bring that back, and you can do it all by yourself, and I can just, just.
So in an earlier talk here, we used to call this slide the true futures, as opposed to the fantasy futures.
Real futures.
Yeah, because there's some real stuff we can actually talk about that's coming along. And so I'm going to start off by talking about that in case you don't know what we're doing in the next year and are committed to. And that'll also give you a feel for the direction we're moving going forward. So all of these different products are things that are going to be shipping real soon now. Like I think in Vista, real soon now.
Like
real today, we're done. Now. Yeah, there's a big party. They have a party in the basement in the parking garage of one of the buildings, and there's an incredible amount of $100 scotch drunk during that party, and I'm going to miss it, and I'm only a little bit bitter.
Well, we're going to have a party on next Friday.
But there will not be, this is the $100 scotch party.
Yeah.
Our own team is not as profligate as the Windows team. Although all those guys are gone now, maybe, huh? So the first thing to talk about is Vista, the features that are so future that they're current. And of course, we're now thinking of them as legacy. And so with .NET Framework 3.0, which already shipped a few days ago down level on Windows XP and Windows Server 2003, it'll also come shipped on all the Vista things. And so that's a bit of a change. It's now actually part of Windows, and you get it with Windows. And there are features in Windows that light up only when you have that there. And so that's the balance we ended up talking about the difference between managed APIs and unmanaged in Windows. And the modules you most care about, in addition to bug fixes and so on, are card space, which is the client-oriented server security token service that can help you manage credentials and passwords for client-based web access. Windows Communication Foundation, which gives you flexible messaging, transport independence in your programs, the code-based programming model that comes with WCF. The Presentation Foundation, which is the new fancy UI tool that gives you incredible control over UI at the level of DirectX 9 and 10. And finally, the Workflow Foundation, which lets you start building up business processes graphically. All the different teams that were building rules in Workflow got together. They built Workflow, which is now shipping, and you're going to see it integrated back into all the other products coming along. The stuff comes with Vista, and here we go. And you've probably heard a lot about this for the last few years. We're really happy that it's done and we can move on. The second thing that's happening is Biztalk Server 2006 R2, which is a release that'll be shipped out automatically to everyone who already has a Biztalk license. And it has a lot of exciting things too, because what we're doing is starting to integrate back the features in Vista into Biztalk, as well as extending it in some really important areas. The first thing that's going on in Biztalk is we're starting to move to integrate the Biztalk messaging system, which is durable and reliable and open to a whole variety of adapters that can get messages from all sorts of systems into the bus, with the WCF channel architecture, which provides nice support for interoperable standards and flexible pluggability. It's easy to customize. And so if you look down across the bottom, what you see is that in R2, we'll have a binding that will allow messages to flow through any WCF channel directly into the Biztalk message box. We're also going to ship an adapter framework and start shipping adapters, which are in fact adapter channels. And so the direction we're going is to eventually integrate all the adapters with the channel architecture so that anywhere you can use an Indigo channel, you'll also be able to use a Biztalk adapter. And so rather than having to use the adapter only over here to feed messages into the Biztalk message box, you'll also be able to use the adapter as a source of messages flowing directly into a WCF application. So you're starting to see that we're interested in moving Biztalk out of the pure silo business and in a direction where you can use the adapters in regular .NET programs. That's a theme I'm going to come back to later. So from the Biztalk point of view, you're going to be able to pull messages from any channel, from the adapters, including adapters you might write to integrate with some custom system, onto the message bus, onto the general channel architecture that provides sort of true, transparent messaging services up to apps. And then we're going to see a whole bunch of different applications plug into that messaging channel, all those different sources. You'll be able to run any WCF service programming model app, which is code marked up with attributes, against any of those message sources. And we support all the WCFs that way. In addition, you're going to be able to pull messages from WCF or Siebel or SAP or any other thing where we have an existing adapter, messages up to the channel architecture and then flow them into Biztalk. So be able to source, to run any kind of messages into the Biztalk system and then use them for integration or managed durable process or any other features that BTS offers. Third, we're looking to take that adapter architecture and use it in MIS so that we'll be running messages from these adapters into the MIS system so that if you have identity information in any of these places, you can integrate it in one place and then move it from there into Active Directory. And finally, ADO.NET is beginning to explore the possibility of having an ADO.NET interface that can access data through sources that are accessible through these channels, because they'd like to provide ADO.NET programming experiences against a lot of these line of business systems. And so the architectural idea that we're pursuing with this feature set is to begin to unify the Biztalk and WCF messaging system so that you get a single messaging plane, all the messaging sources flow into it, and then you can run those messages on into any of the application environments. And all of these kinds of things are starting to show up in R2.
Whoa.
Somebody really went font crazy, and I can't even blame you. Oh, this is a font that doesn't exist, isn't it?
No, that's...
I think that what this is that they don't have Sego on the right Sego on this machine.
But I think they were, you know.
I'm going to translate this into English before giving this talk. That's a little odd, but there you go.
I hope this is okay. Just
so what you see is that the combination of WCF and Biztalk together start to be our service bus and message bus, where all the messages flow onto this backplane, and then they're accessed by all the services that you can plug into the infrastructure. Biztalk provides a way of hooking an application onto there. If I run data from a LOB adapter up into an app that's running in Biztalk. But generally speaking, the fact that all the messages are flowing into this message box means that I get a situation where any kind of an adapter, a .NET adapter running into an existing app, a WCF adapter running into a WCF app, or an LOB adapter running into a .NET app or a Biztalk app, all of these things are just modules that plug into the service bus.
Steve, shall I try to fix that quickly?
No, you shouldn't, Clemens.
Okay.
Because I know you're the kind of purist that is, but it's going to take you a long time, and we're going to have everyone watching it, and it's just not good rhetoric, is all I'm thinking.
Okay, good.
And so what happens is that we build this message and service bus up, and unlike a lot of systems where the message bus is a hub, where the message comes into a server and then has to be plugging into other services at that server, The WCF message bus actually allows you to treat the entire network as a service bus to some extent. Any addressable point can be a place where messages plug in. Biztalk provides the service of integration and message translation. It provides the service of durability and eventing. But you start to see the architecture extending. And what this means is all the different services that are listed very clearly down here at the bottom are all also available on the service bus. For instance, in R2, message durability is going to be exposed through Biztalk up into WCF apps. The whole BAM infrastructure is being extended. So in addition to using BAM to monitor Biztalk apps, you'll also be able to use BAM to monitor WF and WCF applications. So you can take the eventing modeling tools that are provided with BAM today and mark them up so that a pure WCF app can be monitored where you pull data out of the events, or out of the message and into an event, pull it into the BAM infrastructure and monitor it. The app needs to have nothing to do whatsoever with Biztalk itself, but you can use all the BAM facilities on any app built on top of the channel architecture. And I don't even remember what that other one in the corner was, Clemens.
I could tell you if I would fix it, but you're not allowing me to.
Well, I know, Clemens. The entire experience of these people is ruined constantly by my overbearing nature. And I apologize. Whoa.
I think now we
Clemens, would you look at this and see if you can fix it?
Where's the replace fonts? That's in here. So there's no Arial on this thing.
Ooh, that's
oh, now that's interesting.
I would think we should look for Sego, Clemens. Ah, there's it. Now, how did we get through all these other talks?
I have no idea.
Oh, wait, you've got another alphabetical. What they did, double alphabetical?
Apparently.
Don't use the bold one.
How about narrow?
Go down to Sego.
I think that did it.
For the whole system? Clemens, you are a genius. And I only say it this one time.
There's no Arial on this machine.
Your PowerPoint skills are deeply appreciated, OPM master.
Back in the day when I was not working at the firm, I was always thinking why I'm not a PowerPoint MVP.
I bet you could have got that gig if you had wanted.
Yes.
Probably high status among your peers there in the RD program, right?
Yeah, probably not.
Okay, so we did this. Now we're over here.
Oh, and we can read it.
In addition to Biztalk R2 supporting a much richer service bus that extends over the infrastructure services for management, BAM, the discovery services, and UDDI, Biztalk also is going to have in R2 a pretty rich and complete RFID implementation. Microsoft team in India is working on this, and they've actually led the effort to standardize the messages flowing in and out of RFID devices. And so it's a very cool system. At the bottom, the Biztalk system will give you the ability to manage individual RFID devices in a centralized way. If you've ever set up an RFID system, you're going to find, of course, that the thousands of systems you're dealing with are just hideous to manage, and Biztalk really solves that. And they're ongoing with trying to get standards for the kind of devices that move around the site, you know, the devices that live inside, the readers that live inside forklifts and the like. And above that, they have a layer that lets you talk to devices using an abstract API. So the API takes a standard call and translates it through a driver mechanism into the messages that then go down into the device. So all of the functions in these devices are standardized, and you get a programming layer that you can use at the devices to run small workflows. Because one of the tricks that's required in dealing with RFID is aggregating the millions of events that come up to the subset of data that you want to feed into a central place to analyze. And so there's a nice rich programming experiences down at the device layer that lets you take in the events that are coming out of the system and do some initial analysis. And these things are driven by event processes that are run up on the Biztalk system that can run business process in Xlang to deal with the inputs and go ahead and build up analytic data if you want to watch what's going on, run rules to adjust processes, notifications that you need to restock certain areas and the like. And so what this means is that using kind of the same software that you're used to using for integration, or since we're integrating with .NET for just running regular apps, you can now use Biztalk in a kind of hub and spoke way to actually manage a really complex and rich RFID deployment. And this is the kind of thing that if you're at all interested, you're definitely going to want to look into it, because we're in a leadership position here working with the hardware vendors to try to do the standardization.
So if a truck pulls in the truck pulls in the lots, you'll just know all that's in the truck.
Indeed, Clemens, you have the RFID concept down to a T.
I just want to reconfirm that I really knew what was going on.
And you do, Clemens. You know, you might want to move to India and work on this product. You provide a deep insight in that comment.
I was just asking a question whether that was true.
And I appreciate your question. Let's thank him for the deep, wise questions. A round of applause. I'm missing now the gestures that I would have used to ask for the next slide. The second thing coming in the future is Orcas, which is the next release of Visual Studio. And what happens is that we ship in .NET Framework, and so our ship dates right now are kind of linked to the times when another boat comes along that pulls .NET Framework out to the community. So our ship date for a long time has been linked to the Vista ship date, because that was the next release of .NET. The next release of .NET Framework after that is going to be with Orcas, which is a new version of Visual Studio. I'd say it's kind of a Whidbey-like release. The big release is coming down the way. I think it's called Hawaii.
An Everett-like release.
I'm sorry, this is an Everett-like release, a small release between big ones. But we're going to do some cleanup on WCF and some integration. We have some interesting features to talk about. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to completely integrate WCF and WF. During the development of .NET Framework 3.0, WF was one team and WCF was another team. And because each was on its own schedule, we didn't want to do too much work to get them entangled, just in order to manage the complexity of integration risk. But now in Orcas, we're going to merge them completely. And so there'll be activities in WF that let you pull WCF messages up and trigger chains of behavior. And there'll be other activities inside WF that lets you send messages or make calls. And so what that means is that you'll be able to expose your workflow via WCF channels, or alternatively, you'll be able to implement WCF services using the WF programming model. So at this point, you want to think about the architecture as having the WF channel framework and bindings as the foundation, and then the WF programming model and the WCF programming model both plugged in on top. And my boss says the moment you go from 1 to 2, you get to many. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think you'll see us continue to innovate in programming experience on top of the channel framework as we try different declarative and richer, higher level programming models moving forward. But this is a nice feature. And of course, in order to do this, we also have to think about some services that are right now only available in WF and move them into WCF. So you're going to see features like the durability of WF services, where you can run them long time and persist them to disk, available also for the code-based services in WCF. And you'll be able to have a session in the WCF sense that lasts across multiple channels. So you can send messages to an instance, regardless of whether it's implemented in WCF or WF, that might come and go over a week and spend most of the time as instances living in the store. And so what you're going to see is for us to move the features of WF and WCF together. We're going to start that in Orcas, and we'll see how far we get. We'll continue there for a while. That was an embarrassing sound you just made, Clemens.
It wasn't me. I was just
amplified by your microphone. The second thing we're going to address in Orcas is partial trust. It turns out that it's an incredibly complicated thing to do partial trust while you're doing a V1, because your code base is changing its structure regularly till close to ship. The biggest difficulty, it turns out, in implementing partial trust is not the coding work, but rather the test harness, the testing strategy, and just the overall source code control thing where you portion off parts of the code that need to run in partial trust in order to present that feature to whole. So for example, ASP.NET didn't ship with partial trust in V1, it shipped in 1.1. And just so, we're going to ship partial trust in the next release after our V1. And partial trust has both a server feature side and a client feature side. On the client, you're going to be able to do just what you can do with web services in ASP.NET. You're going to be able to download proxy information to a client from a server, and then use that proxy to talk back to other services on the same machine.
So we're really setting up the source control system that we're using for our development that has an additional gate for, we have identified zones of the code that we need to run in that environment, and there's a gate that you need to go through. You need to supply information to actually get source code checked into that area. So there's a whole engineering practice going on around this to actually enable this, this medium trust thing.
Yeah, this turns out to have been invented as a practice by the WPF team in V1. And what it lets us do is alert whenever code is checked into that area, and you have to get authorization to check in there, and an incredible set of tests. And so what that does is once we make it miserable for developers to check into that space, they tend to be very much more careful about doing so. And so it really, like I said, is much more of a process invention and testing thing than it is the actual feature work. So there's three kinds of medium trust things we're doing here. So we do the server, the client side is about downloading proxies that can be used in partial trust clients. And the server side is about being able to constrain the behavior of services running inside a WAS and IaaS so that they're running in a restricted mode in medium trust. And those features are aimed mostly when you're trying to host services for 2 or more people where you don't want them interfering with each other. And so this will provide increased ability to support WCF and WF services in Orcas using in ISV situations. The guy's getting tired of being squeezed after 3 days. And the final thing we're going to be focusing on is to make it easier and easier to code to internet scope. One of the oddest kind of conversations in the world today is the debate between REST and WS star. And the reason I think it's odd is because I don't understand its technical merit. I think where it comes from is the fact that in some of the stacks that people are using in the public domain today, you have to know about the protocols you're using when you're doing XML messaging. And for that reason, the programming experience becomes more complicated when you have more protocols to use. But this thing goes on and becomes almost religious in terms of REST programming being a complete and rigorous way to develop all applications. And it's true that REST is incredibly useful when you're at the deep remove of the internet, where you have very little features you need other than to get documents moving around. But if you think about how this works at WCF, all the details of the protocol on the wire are dealt with in the binding and have nothing to do with the programming experience. So I can write an application in WCF that has the basic verbs of REST, and then I can expose it both on a RESTful binding, where it can be accessed by those kind of people, and on a SOAP binding with no additional coding. And the reason you want to do that is the answer to the question of WS star versus REST really is, if REST is good enough for your purposes, then by all means use it. But there are all sort of features like extended security, routing-based, security through routers, claims-based security, where you need other data in the headers. And the nice thing about the WCF programming model is it lets you move back and forth so that you can use simple wire protocols when they're sufficient, and then you can reconfigure them to get the richer support when you want it. And so we're doing a lot of work in this area to extend that, so as you'll be able to do things like use Indigo services to deal with AJAX and JSON. AJAX and JSON are the protocols that are being used to enable scripting and processing inside a Web 2.0 user interfaces. We're going to have deep support for RSS and Atom, so it'll be easy enough if you want to set up an RSS feed in your app, you'll just new up a class and start it. You don't need to have it in a web service. You don't need to have it anywhere else. And we're going to have richer REST and POC support so that you can have easy programming experience with pre-canned contracts and bindings, so that you can you can write an application that you know will be RESTful and then expose it with any protocols you like. So the way to think about all this is that the nice thing about the Indigo channel architecture is it lets you deal with particular protocol issues independent of the programming experience, and we're going to take advantage of that to extend it out to deal with all these other standard protocols in the market. The next thing that's coming out within sight is Windows Server Longhorn Server. That's coming out sometime down the road next year. And there's a couple of important features that are happening there. The first thing that's happening is that we're extending the security architecture. If you heard our talk earlier today about security, there's a bunch of services that Windows is providing on the server, including richer support for identity in Active Directory, including richer support for claims management in the authorization manager, and including the ability to do federation with the federation service. What we're doing is consolidating those things, cleaning up the programming interfaces, enriching the extensibility so you can deal with more kinds of certificates easier, and support the ability to actually upgrade the feature set in all the new processes, the federation system and the claims manager. In addition, we're going to roll out a new generation of MIS technologies, focused less on the MIS platform per se and more on the tools needed to deal with some of these advanced identity management systems. So there's an aggressive end-to-end release being envisioned from the design time and architecture time on through to the IT time, where we're going to be moving forward in the identity space. Probably 1/3 of the people in our division are working on identity in one way or another, and so it's an incredibly important commitment that will ship mostly via the vehicle of Longhorn Server or through MIS. The second thing that's happening in Longhorn Server is a bunch of innovations in transactions. The way the transaction architecture works today is there's a thing called a transaction manager. And what happens is if different resources that are stateful want to coordinate error handling through transaction managers, they just have to find one nearby and register with it. And then all the transaction managers talk to one another when they need to share coordination. Well, one of the things we've already done in the current releases is make that process really cheap. So when you go register with your transaction manager, it doesn't initially do any work to make it a distributed transaction until news comes in that there's a second transaction manager that's involved. And only then do you pay the overhead. So earlier on with enterprise services, the moment that you establish a transaction, it would become distributed, and it would be expensive to use enterprise services or CommPlus because you did that overhead. Now there's virtually no cost at all to using enterprise services unless you use a second resource manager. And so nowadays we fixed it so the problem of using the declarative transaction infrastructure is purely a simplification for you, and there's no longer any performance issues. The cool thing that happens in Longhorn Server is the OS team has built another transaction manager into the kernel called the KTM. And so now you can coordinate transactions in your database and your application with stateful changes to the system. You can set up a file system to be transacted so that when you do an installation that involves apps running, databases changing, and files being added to the file system, if there's an error in any of those places, you can roll it back. So you can easily remove all the files that you installed under a transaction. In addition, the registry is going to be transacted, so that if you do an install that involves changing the registry and adding files to the file system, and you abort it, all those changes roll back. So as you can see, a lot of installation problems become much easier with this, and system management in general. And because we're obviously focused on the system manager, it turns out the command executable actually has a transaction thing that lets you start a transaction scope in a script. So you can start in a transaction scope and then run a .NET application, and they'll all run under the same transaction. So this increase in Longhorn Server's ability to integrate application and database transactions with OS transactions is a big leap forward for people building apps that deal with stateful changes to the OS. Clemens, in order to harass me when he built this slide, likes to think that this is my picture. And apparently I am now going from the phase where I'm talking about what I used to call real futures to the fake futures now. So the rest of this time, the way you want to think of me is that I'm going to be sharing the work we're doing as we're designing our next release or two. And we're going to tell you the various things we're thinking about in that process. The first thing to think about is this is a very exciting time, technically, as are all times. But there's a lot of things going on these days that are obviously going to influence both the apps you're thinking of writing and the trends we want to take advantage of as we move on. One of the things that's happened over the course of the last 30 years is that architectural advances in tool sets have made it easier to build bigger and bigger apps. So it was much easier to build local executables when we started moving from go-tos and common blocks to structured code. It was even easier when we realized that objects were a good way of organizing code in an executable. Components come along and make it easier for us to organize pluggable things into an executable. Services come along to let us organize an enterprise scope in a less coupled way. And now you see the internet wave coming along, where the internet itself starts to become the scope at which we want to build apps. And while we have a lot of features like enterprise service buses and all those other patterns that we can use to organize code at enterprise scope, we're really on our own when we're truly dealing at internet scope. And so what we need to do is to take seriously the fact that people are going to start building complex applications at internet scope. And what can we do to support that? What infrastructure services can we build out that are going to make that process easy? So we see that, the business of building apps at broad scope like that, as a key driver to our technology. The second thing we look a lot at is models. In the same way as sandboxes elevated the programming experience from C# in the 90s to Java and C#, or excuse me, from C++ in the 90s to Java and .NET in this decade, just so we believe that the next big leap in programming is going to be moving up a level so that more and more of applications are expressed declaratively in models rather than imperatively in code. And you see that all the time in domain-specific languages and the ability to set up a structure that makes it easier then to build the particular app you care about. The reason this is good is twofold. First off, it brings the level of abstraction up. One of the great values of the sandbox and not needing to carry around memory pointers anymore is it makes programmers more efficient because they spend more time dealing with logic and less time dealing with infrastructure. Well, as you move up the stack even higher and deal with models rather than code, you're expressing increasingly clearly the logic you're dealing with without having to worry about the implementation algorithm so much. And so modeling makes it easier for the developer to be efficient. The second thing that happens is it's really difficult to write a tool that peers into code and sees the structure of an application. Whereas as applications are represented more often as models, we can build a lot of tools that look at that code and help you deal with things like threading and synchronization and correctness and exchange patterns and distributed applications. If we have a model of an entire distributed app, we can tell all the services that are involved in it or all the things that are connected to the service bus and provide management and debugging experiences to the unity of your app rather than to the individual piece. If a workflow model exists, we don't just have to run the workflow single-threaded. We can use transactions to manage synchronization and run threads in when we see they don't happen to be accessing concurrent data. So models are going to help you because they're going to make you and your developers more efficient. And models are going to help us help you by making it possible for us to provide increasingly rich tools. And so we see this as a trend that's happening across the industry that we want to get a hold of and move forward and try to be thought leaders in the space. The third thing we see is federation. I've talked a lot about federation in these last few talks. And the way I think about federation in the broadest sense is that federation is about embracing diversity rather than trying to impose similarity. Instead of a world where we expect all the applications to be written in one programming language or on one operating system or using one database or in one hosting model, one security environment, and so on, we expect to be able to start dealing from our platform with federating difference into an individual view. And we can do a lot of work there to provide you tools that make it easier to deal with multiple databases or multiple hosting environments or multiple languages. And so we see as a major trend that we want to exploit, trying to grab a hold of diversity and making it all acceptable and toolable within our environment. And that's the thing that's going to propel us. And finally, we see a lot of interest in beginning to think hard about clouds. In current world, everything that you use, your service bus, your directory, and all those other pieces of your app are running inside your enterprise. And where we see the world going is that there are going to be services that many applications are going to be happy to host in the cloud. This is the world changes back and forth between centralized and decentralized and centralized. With Internet Scope, there comes an ability to start looking at which services you'd rather not manage yourself and pay someone to manage for you. And so the challenge that exposes for us as platform vendors is, how do we tool integration with your code and cloud services? How do we manage applications that have service level agreements, part of which depends on the performance of a cloud service? And so across the board, when we're designing our modules, we're thinking hard about the question in each case, how does this interrelate with cloud scope? How can this service be hosted out there at great scale? And we're taking it as an architectural constraint to think hard about this in each of our areas. So these are 4 things that are going to impact us tremendously. Broad Internet scope, declarative rather than imperative implementation strategies, federation of diversity so that you can deal with it as unity, and cloud services. A second thing that's interesting is that if we look out in the market and we try to decide what we want to compete with, there's a lot of different stuff. And there's new stuff all the time. And things are very fragmented. And you can find people who will have big wars between message-oriented middleware and enterprise service buses. And then when you find out that they're actually talking about the same thing and they're arguing over a word. A lot of people make their money picking one of these words and advocating it as the next great thing. But the point is there's a lot of fragmentation in this marketplace. There's a lot of different approaches being explored. There isn't a unity. And so one of the things we think about is that an opportunity we have is to try to start consolidating these things. To have a platform which can be B2B, and it can be EAI, and it can be ESD, and it can be event-driven. We talked about that a couple of times, and we dealt with various topics, that there's actually not that much difference architecturally between these patterns. And so what I'd love to see us be able to get to in 1 or 2 or 3 releases is to have all the services that all these things need in a single platform. If you want to think of it this way, in the same way as we built .NET so we could host many different languages on that platform, we'd love to build our connected system platform so we can support many different ones of these meta patterns or architectural patterns. We see our opportunity, rather than having a way of building all applications, be it SOA or ESB. I'm sure our marketing guys will pick one of those names and say that's what we are, because it makes it clearer to people what's going on in their minds. But the plain fact is, as a technical person, I want to be able to support applications written in these styles. And rather than having our platform oriented towards one of them, I want it to be rich enough that it can support a variety of them. And so the opportunity we face is to sort of sit in the middle of this confusion and make a claim that we can support them all, because the differences between them are largely illusory or language. Now, part of what I was trying to do to ground this talk was to go around to all of the bosses who have made broad talks where they spoke about the future and tried to write down goals. Because where I'm going here with all these goals is that I'm eventually going to speculate about the technology we'll need to build in a variety of areas in order to satisfy these goals. And so when you talk about the Biztalk Server R2 and future, the three things that people are thinking about wanting to do with Biztalk out to the future are, first, there's a lot of talk by a lot of people about people-ready process. People-ready process is our words for things that some people call business process, some people call human workflow. It's the kind of thing we were talking about in our presentation architecture talk, where rather than having to build workflows or process definitions that are all about code, we want to make it easy for you to move back and forth between modules that are oriented towards automation and modules that are oriented towards tasks that users have to perform. And we want the development experience and the design experience and the runtime experience to be the same for those two kind of programs. We'd like to integrate things like tasks and org charts and so on into the world and let you build apps on top of that kind of a foundation. And so in addition to supporting code-oriented applications, we want to focus really hard on models and rule sets that are there to do human integration and direct representation of business process. The second thing that people talk a lot about wanting to do is to break down the artificial wall between Biztalk and .NET. What happens is, in integration systems is, the first time you need to do integration, you got some smart coder who sits down and hacks together some solution. And that person, if they're lucky, has got themselves a job for 10 years, because then they get to do the second solution and then the third solution, and pretty soon they've got code that only they can understand that's tying together every app in your business. And the problem is all that work kind of goes to waste the moment you go and bring in an integration application, an EAI solution, because now you got to change everything to the new platform. And that's because the strategy of Biztalk can't be approached slowly. Simultaneously, Biztalk has all sort of really cool features like orchestration and management and hosting and the adapters and the message pipelines, the nice separation between public contract and implementation contract. And those features are only useful when you're in a Biztalk application. And so a lot of customers have asked for us, and a lot of our managers have said that one of our goals are to break down that difference. So looking at it one way, we want to bring a lot of .NET features into Biztalk, so that if you're building a Biztalk app, it's more like the experience of .NET. Looked at the other way, I want to be able to incrementally add Biztalk features into my .NET application. And so what you're going to see is an erosion of the difference between Biztalk and .NET. Now, the last time I explained that to customers, somehow they said that they heard that as me saying Biztalk is going to go away. And so I don't mean by that all the features of Biztalk are going to appear in the .NET framework that gets distributed down. What I'm saying is that you could imagine a .NET framework that you get with the operating system, and then when you buy Biztalk and install it on your machine, it lights up .NET with a huge number of additional features appropriate for these kind of applications. So I'm not talking at all about SKUs. I don't know anything about SKUs. But I'm talking about the technological goal of trying to eliminate the step between .NET and Biztalk without changing how we sell it. The third thing people ask for a lot in Biztalk is low latency messaging. Right now, Biztalk, in order to be reliable, copies all of its messages into the disk. And people want to run those kind of applications without copying things into disk. It turns out if we succeed at moving Biztalk kind of features into .NET world, you imagine that you'd be able to write a Biztalk app, but instead of using the message bus for its interconnects, you could just use TCP or HTTP over a WCF channel. And so to me, that third feature is just a subset of the second. So those two things, requirements that come out of the Biztalk world, are talking about new kind of applications that make business process more concrete in your design and implementation, and erasing the boundary between Biztalk and .NET. And what we see in Orcas that we think is likely to carry forward is A, the focus on internet scope, on Web 2.0, on applications that are speaking at greater remove than the enterprise. with an eye towards supporting your ability to build applications that run at either enterprise scope or internet scope as your architecture needs. In the same way as WCF eliminated architectural decisions that were bound on the fact that I've got to move to a new implementation platform to do queuing, just so we hope by giving you internet scope that the distance between one module and another in your service becomes less important architecturally, and you can think of the same feature set it both removes. And the second, the fact that we're integrating WCF and WF is a thing that's going to go on for a while, where we want to increasingly expand the scope of declarative programming and integrate it with our imperative feature set. So over time, you wouldn't want there to be features that are available in WCF, but not WF, and vice versa. And in the long run, we'd like to make the model part of the development process more and more extensive. Finally, we see three kind of features, three kind of programming experiences that we think we're going to focus on. The first is mission-critical enterprise apps. Because we're carrying Biztalk forward and merging it with .NET, we need increasingly to be able to think about applications written in Biztalk and .NET that can be used in a mission-critical way. And so this involves a focus on architecture, a focus on reliability, all the abilities, so that we can get high availability, high security, the kind of thing you need to stake out an increasing ability to use .NET to build that kind of app. And so those kind of apps are a big, important focus of ours. The second kind of apps that are important to us are what we call connected clients or rich connected clients. And these include clients that are built on top of the Web 2.0 world, where you download a small amount of logic into a browser or onto your machine and run the client app there. If you've seen OA, you realize that the gap between the kind of apps you can build with executables and the kind of apps you can build with Web 2.0 is decreasing over time. And so we see a lot of need to handle messaging from those kind of apps and the programming experience in those kind of apps to deal with synchronization. And so the platform work required to make it easier to do that app is important to us. One of the things people kick around on the team these days is we'd like it if a regular person could build Outlook. Outlook is one of the hardest client apps I know, and the people who do it are phenomenal. And we'd like everyone to be able to build that app if they need to. And third, like I said before, we're focused a lot on examples of people-ready process. The way we deal with these kind of scenarios is we're looking at applications within Microsoft or our team that we want to build on top of our next generation platform. So for instance, in the space of people-ready process, we'd like to be able to build an app that ran our bug tracking system or our review process. You know, the business processes that our team does, we're going to try to implement on our platform just to get a feel for what we're up to. Connected clients, we want to build file share apps that let our developers get at the files on their servers during the evening so that they can work without having to log in and go through VPN. The developers say they're trying to do it to get at their music at home while they're at work. And mission critical enterprise apps, we're looking around for one of the big apps that runs at Microsoft to see if they'll let us re-implement it on our platform during the next cycle. So that's the way we use these themes, is we try to look at particular examples of these applications, and then we have a team dedicated to implement the app that illustrates this theme that's part of our test harness, part of our way of seeing whether or not we're doing it. And of course, they run into the usability problems easier than we do when we're thinking about this stuff from the platform up. How are we doing, Clemens? The fact that I bored you so much that you're not even bothering me is a scary thought.
No, you're not. I'm being enlightened, so I don't even dare to harass you.
Really?
Yeah.
What do you think will happen?
You mean at work?
No, dare harass me. You have never not dared to harass me before in my entire life.
You know,
What are you afraid of?
I think your wisdom is just stunning and silencing me. So just continue, please.
I'm not going to take you out to dinner regardless of all this talk. So, okay, I'm not allowed to tell you about any futures, but I'm going to try to finish up this talk by this is the picture of the entire world of connected systems. at a level of vagueness that I hope runs not afoul of any of our marketing people. So over here we have a distributed application. And that's a big wad of stuff. One of the things I hope is to be somebody at Microsoft who actually takes the word application to mean something at a customer site that does what I care about, rather than something running in an app domain or something running in SQL. So when I say distributed application, I mean what I hope you mean by app, like a bunch of stuff that does something you care about that's running in different places and different environments. And so we want to focus on that. And each of the pieces of your application runs in a host. And I like to think of a host in a very general way, so I think of the shell as a host because it runs exes. I think of the NT scum as a host because it runs services. I think of COM+ as having a host because it service host, where service host runs services and DLL host runs COM+ components. I think of WAS and IIS as a host. I think of SQL as a host. All the different Biztalk as a host. All the different processes that run pieces of application logic. And so I want to focus for a while on hosting. I want to talk also about app frameworks, how we're going to build programs. I want to talk about identity and access, the security infrastructure. I want to talk about transactions, the error coordination infrastructure. I want to talk about communications, the message bus, the service bus that we're working on and is going to start showing up in Biztalk R2. And finally, I want to talk about tooling. And since I don't want to say anything concrete that those of you who happen to be reporters or analysts will quote and take back to the company, you should understand what I'm doing is just offering you speculations about the kinds of things that I imagine we might have to build someday in order to meet the goals and deal with the market conditions that I talked about earlier. So we're going to walk through each of these 7 boxes, and we're going to just speculate together on what might be needed to achieve the goals I was just talking about. So communications is going to need to deal with a lot of stuff. When I think of communications, I sort of think of it breaking into 2 parts. One part of it is just purely the message bus, the ability to get data from one point to another. The kind of thing WCF does, although you might imagine the message bus having a richer set of features in the future to deal with internet scope, like relays and so on. Things you can already get with PureNet that you probably will be able to get in a richer way in the future. And I also think of the communication layer as having things like the service bus, an ESB, where it has features like naming and multicast and discovery and so on. You know, features that would let me set up a thing that I get when I have a service bus running on a machine in my back office, but at these broader scopes. And so what kind of stuff am I going to need? Well, the first thing I'm going to need is the ability to deal with these kind of features of the communication layer at internet scope and integrating cloud services. How am I going to be able to build an app like an ESB architecture where the pieces are on the laptop of a salesperson and in the back office and in the cloud and at somebody's home? But I still want to use that ESB pattern. I want to plug messages into the service bus and have them go to modules that are subscribed to them. I want to get an event-driven architecture. And so the communication, there's a lot of challenges that we're facing over the next releases to enrich the communication bus to have that kind of functionality. We need the communication bus to be protocol rich, so no one decides not to use the application because they need some protocol that we don't support. You know, we want to eliminate the REST and POX arguments. And we also want to keep the communication layer protocol agnostic because we found it's incredibly appealing to our customers to be able to build an app and then reconfigure it to use TCP or HTTP as they need. There's a whole bunch of features in the Biztalk world, PubSub, eventing, adapters that let me plug into any sort of source, and the pipelines that let me do message transformation. If I want to support the merging of the .NET and Biztalk world, then I'm going to have to support all of those features in a .NET application. So if you go and buy Biztalk and install it on your machine, suddenly you get the ability to do the Biztalk pipeline in any old Indigo channel. You get the ability to do eventing and PubSub in any old .NET application, extended by Biztalk. And so clearly the communication bus is going to have to grow a lot for these reasons, because of the increased scope and the desire to meet these different enterprise patterns at internet and cloud scope, and because I want the communication bus to be completely adequate to current Biztalk customers in building their applications. There's a lot of things involved in the application framework that arise out of our focus on the various clients we need. We're going to have to extend the application framework a lot over the next few releases if we want to support rich connected clients. If you remember the talk, if you were at the talk we gave about presentation, you'll see a lot of our detailed thinking there. A connected client just becomes a user-oriented service in my architecture. And what I need from the framework is the ability to have messages and UI simultaneously affecting data. You know, a normal service just has messages coming in from the bus. An app that has messages coming in from the bus and from the user is a whole different thing. And so we're going to have to work out the framework to handle that level of integration and commit strongly to features in the framework to deal with connected clients and people-ready process, so that you can imagine building up both a distributed application and a local node of that application using rules and workflow and other kinds of abstractions. Those kind of abstractions we think are going to give us huge gains in the usability and the reliability and the productivity of apps, because as we get more metadata, we found that we have a lot of important ways to innovate, to analyze that metadata, to do a lot of testing and error checking for customers. Keith Short and Bill Gibson, who are two people who are lead architects on Visual Team Architect the Visual Team Architect in the previous edition, some of our best modelers, have moved over to join our division. And so one of the things we think a lot about in the app framework is, how do we carry forward the Team Architect charter, where we want to be able, A, to deal with a broader range of the life cycle. You know, we want to think about an app during its design and architecture as well as its implementation. And then we'd like to carry it on and actually be able to run the darn thing. And so that kind of scenario where we have a framework that can handle those kind of apps is important to us too. We need to be able to think of how to integrate the local application with cloud services. What's the programming experience somebody expects from a cloud service? Is it different? Do you just get at the cloud service through the bus? Or do you talk directly to them? Is there some programming model appropriate to the cloud that's different from the local programming model? What we found in the past is that when we try to project a programming model from one scope to a broader scope, we almost always get it wrong. Projecting objects out to a distributed app was a mistake. Bringing services into a local app, on the other hand, makes sense when you don't mind the decoupling cost. And so we may need a different programming model to deal with that broader scope. And finally, there's a whole host of abstractions that are in Biztalk. You know, they're really nice, rich world of ports and pipelines and transforms and so on that need to be integrated into the rest of the .NET framework so that you can use all those ideas in local apps that are written in straight .NET. Now, one of the problems with hosting is that it's all in a pretty lumpy and disconnected way. If you've ever run an application in IIS and run it in DLL host and run it in SQL, each of those three environments gives you a different set of management APIs and a different set of events and a different set of runtime services. And most distributed applications run in more than one host. And so the trick is, we're going to have to address the problem of being able to deal with all those hosts as if they were a unity.
But accept the reality of them being different, not build one.
Exactly. And so what we need to do is to be able to provide a level of abstraction above the individual hosts and a model that describes an entire app and lets you build that app and deploy that app and manage that app and get events out of that app as though it were a unity in a standard way. And we don't know yet whether that means modifying the existing hosts or adding a layer on top, a new thing that we have we're just exploring those ideas. But in order to deal with an app that's truly distributed on our platform, we're going to have to be able to find a way of dealing with those hosts in a federated way, letting them be different, but trying to provide a unified view. A second thing we're going to have to deal with is hosting process. I've never been real clear about the difference between a process server and an app server. But one of the things I can tell about it is processes tend to run longer than apps for some reason. Processes tend to be stateful. And so what do we do to host the process? Well, if we host it in IIS, IIS is meant for stateless things and tends to kill app domains upstream, in May. So we're going to have to deal with coming up with a host that works well for a process that runs a month. Again, will we build a new host? Will we use the existing ones? That remains to be seen, but we need to be able to grab a hold of the Biztalk hosting features and move them so that they can be accessed against .NET. I think that the identity and access path forward is actually the clearest one, because we've just gone through a revolution in how we think about this over the last year or so. And we've changed our way of thinking from integrating the notion of identity and access so that all the access checks are done against identities, to a new world where we think of identity, which is who you are, in a authenticated way, and then what you're allowed to do is a completely separate thing, a claim you make about a fact that says, I'm allowed access to that disk. And then the federation part that has protocols that allows different domains of identities to interact with their claims. So you can keep a set of identities, I can keep a set of identities. We manage their claims in a local app-oriented way. And then we have standard protocols we can use to federate our statements about claims together. So people that I know who they are can use your resources once we've agreed to make that trade. And this stuff has all been worked out pretty well. And so the identity and access team, unlike a lot of our teams, actually have the good thinking behind them, and the roadmap is in place. And they're just implementing on that strategy. They're building out a bunch of things that should let us do federation at cloud scope, that should let us really be clean about architecting our apps with claims orientation, that should allow us to federate these domains. In addition, we want to focus a lot on features like Biztalk single sign-on, to give you one example, which are currently implemented in a kind of one-off way. And rather than having a special little store for all the credentials you need on sign-on, to just treat them as claims. I come into an app, I have a claim that says I'm allowed to use this app in this way. The system says, oh, okay, if you're allowed to do that, you're going to need these 4 claims, which happen to be the username and password that gets me into SAP. So I don't have to do impersonation anymore and play all sort of tricky games with running under identities that have access or having these funny stores. The architecture we have for identity and access right now lets me move forward and implement these things all in a standard way. And so this team has a lot of their strategy laid out in front of and public. And so the way I would go about learning this is to look up Kim Cameron's identity blog and start reading the things that we've made public about that strategy.
And the ADFS documentation on TechNet is also very useful for that.
Now, a couple of years ago, we had a guy named Pat Helen wandering around saying that transactions were dead. And now he works somewhere else. And so we don't think transactions are dead anymore. He's actually very happy. He works at Amazon now, and he's actually responsible for building something real, which I think is a good discipline for his wisdom path. How is that? I hope someone tells me. That just came right out, and I love it. I got to write it down.
Steve.
Sorry.
In
Pat and I are good friends. Whenever Pat and I meet each other, we expose our belly buttons and do a chant that only we know. Anyways, transactions. And so we don't think transactions are dead at all, but it is certainly true that the strategies you need to use to coordinate errors in relatively tightly coupled applications happening in a short period of time, which involve locks and ACID transactions and a two-phase commit protocol, those strategies simply aren't going to hold us as we move forward and deal with long-running process. And so since you know we got a transaction team, and since you know we care about coordinating errors, And since we're talking about long-running process, you can infer that there's a challenge we're going to have to deal with in how to coordinate errors in multiple services running on a service bus. One of the examples of that is BEPL, and while we have a deep commitment to BEPL, BEPL is not really a very service-oriented, event-driven thing. BEPL, you kind of have all the modules dealing with the errors through their contract. What if I want to have several different services that are all on a service bus and they're all talking and they nonetheless have to deal with problems? Also, problems don't necessarily mean the end of the world, right? In a long-running process, it may be that a problem just changes what I do. You know, an error over here can't order the part from Fred. They have me go and try to order the part from Beth instead. And so there needs to be a way of dealing with problem states as an integral part of a service-oriented application. And that's a key thing that the transaction team needs to focus on.
And something we might be doing in that area too is just to give in to the fact that some things are just not be solvable by just pure programming model or programming techniques, but that we need to involve people in resolving things, right? You've done something in your process, you find out that at the last minute something doesn't work, but you've already promised to a customer, what do you do? But then there's got to be a way, we need to give you an avenue to actually tell a call center agent to call that person and apologize on behalf of the company. So all these are valid error resolution strategies, and we're thinking hard about how to really go out into the people-ready process thing that we talked about, and also think about framework that let you automate those error handling things. But we think of error handling transactions as just one integrated set of solution frameworks that we want to give you for your distributed apps.
The other two things that the transaction team is thinking a lot about are, first, Biztalk achieves a lot of its reliability, as do many other middleware systems, ESBs and the like, by being a unified system. So this one module knows everything about the application. If we want to do ESB-like or event-driven systems at broader scope, there's likely not going to be a central system that understands everything that's going on. And so one of the challenges that the transaction team faces is, how do they get the equivalent reliability and guaranteed completeness of a Biztalk system at scale? Finally, at the other extreme, one of the things that's real interesting to the transaction team is dealing with multi-threading and other access issues in the small. You know, hardware is moving forward so that memory and the various chips on a board might become transacted someday. Imagine being in the transaction team in that time, where in addition to dealing with these things at great breadth, you're also trying to come up with how the framework can work in a world where we're trying to push transactions down into the CLR. You can imagine a day where every stateful class in the CLR could be transacted. So if you wanted to back out changes you made to your hash table, you would just abort a transaction locally, rather than having to write a really ugly catch block that suddenly becomes very decoupled as opposed to your lovely logic above. So the transaction guys are facing a lot of interesting challenges, both at broad scope and at local scope, that they're going to be thinking about over the next cycle or two. Finally, the tools guys. The tool people have a big hunk of work to do because we need to think about relatively radical improvements to our tooling experience. The White Horse agenda of dealing with model-driven tools at scope across the life cycle is something we embrace completely. And so we're working with those teams to try to come up with tools that work both at local scope in modules and at distributed scope for your entire app that are model-driven, that present the right sort of picture. And that's a big challenge. You know, boxes with lines between them are great when you're putting together services in an n-tier architecture. But if you're doing an event-driven app, that's probably not the right picture, right? You just have individual modules putting messages into a bus and then event subscriptions that funnel them up to other places. Well, how do we draw that? It's not even clear. There's a lot of work to be done there. How we do modeling of federation, how we do modeling of internet scope. One of the things we're real interested in is to try to come up with tools for distributed apps that are more oriented towards a higher level persona than Visual Studio. You know, if I bring up Visual Studio and I see a bunch of registers in the bottom corner with debugging information, that might not be the right thing for my dad or
a business analyst.
Or a PM.
Or a PM, like me.
Or me, Clemens. And so the trick is the tooling team is a relatively new experience where we need to work with Visual Studio to come up with increased breadth and increased depth, an easier experience. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to do undo in some of those hard times in Visual Studio? Well, Clemens, now it's that sad moment where I have shown you that when talking all by myself, I can come in right on time without anyone dancing and pointing and causing you to go fast through the last slides.
I'm baffled. Are you at the final slide now? Wow.
I don't even know when the final slide is? That's a secret I wish I didn't
No, I
know.
was just teasing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
teasing,
yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming to all these things. Before you go, we want to give you one last chance to hear about going to the Iron Architect talks where you can show your skills at horsemanship by being the architectural knight who rides in, tramples on everyone who's been before you in the contest, comes up with the prize and carries it away. Clemens and I are going to spend as much time as we can tomorrow down in the booths that we're involved with, which might be the Biztalk booth or the Architect booth or the .NET Framework booth.
We'll just hang out.
And we'll be delighted to answer your questions. It'd be great to get to talk to you and get you to teach us some things about your requirements. And finally, if you go fill out session feedback for us, not only will it teach us how to give these kind of talks better, and you could tell us whether you like this format of a bunch of interrelated talks, but it will also perhaps win you a prize, like a lovely Zen Vision player.
But I think there's an opportunity to fill in written comments, which are very, very useful for us to, if you give feedback, we get those and we get to read those and we're really interested in those. So if you just spend the minute to just tell us what you think about the whole series and whether you like that format, whether you want to have that repeated, of course, with an updated or completely different thing, whether you have some other people doing this, but it would be really useful for us, for the TechEd organizers, whether you are interested in a longer span set of talks as we've given this time for the first time.
And it will be particularly useful to Clemens if you point out ways in which I am already better at him in speaking and he can grow. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you.